Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, today we gather to reflect on a profound and timeless truth, the grace and power of God, woven throughout the fabric of human history. The stories we are about to explore are not simply tales of miracles or distant events. They are living testimonies speaking across generations of how God's grace and power continue to shape our lives and the world in ways we often cannot comprehend. Grace is a gift not earned. It is a central and profound truth at the heart of Christian teaching, and yet it is a concept that is often misunderstood or underappreciated. In a world that emphasizes merit, achievement, and personal responsibility, the idea of grace as something that is freely given, something that we cannot earn or deserve, runs counter to much of what we are taught from an early age. But this is exactly what makes grace so transformative. It is a radical departure from the transactional nature of most human relationships, where we often give in order to receive or expect something in return. Grace, in its purest form, asks nothing in return. It simply is. To understand grace, it is helpful to first reflect on the nature of the human condition. From the earliest stages of our lives, we are taught that value is something to be earned. If we work hard, if we perform well, if we meet expectations, we are rewarded. This system, merit-based, transactional, is what governs much of our world, from school grades to promotions at work. Even in our personal relationships, we often find ourselves struggling with unspoken expectations where we give to others in the hope that we will receive something in return. This creates a world of tit for tat, where worth is measured by what we contribute or achieve. In such a world, the idea that we could receive something without having to earn it can be disorienting, even difficult to accept. Yet this is the essence of grace. It is not about what we do or don't do. It is not about our moral record, our good deeds, or our religious observance. Grace exists because God, in His infinite love, chooses to extend it to us irrespective of our actions or condition. Grace is an unmerited favor, a gift that has nothing to do with what we deserve. It is an expression of God's goodness that is lavished upon us simply because God is good. Grace challenges the natural human inclination toward earning. It calls us to let go of the notion that we must work to deserve love, forgiveness, or acceptance. The Apostle Paul, in his letters to the early churches, repeatedly emphasizes that grace is not something that can be earned by works. He writes in Ephesians 2:8-9, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." This verse is a cornerstone of Christian theology, underscoring that salvation, spiritual deliverance, and reconciliation with God is a gift, not a transaction. No one can claim to have earned it, and no amount of good deeds can make us worthy of it. In our everyday lives, the implications of grace can be profound. The idea that we cannot earn God's favor can be both freeing and unsettling. It frees us from the pressure of performing, from the endless striving to meet external standards or to measure up to some ideal of goodness. But it can also be unsettling because it confronts our desire for control and our tendency to base our self-worth on accomplishments or accolades. We are so used to measuring ourselves and others by tangible markers, grades, income, popularity, that the thought of being accepted or loved without such measures can be hard to internalize. One of the greatest challenges in understanding grace is accepting its unconditional nature. If God's grace is unearned, then it is not dependent on our behavior, our success, or our ability to follow rules. This can be particularly difficult in a religious context where faith communities may consciously or unconsciously create an environment in which grace feels conditional. People may feel they have to act a certain way, follow specific rituals, or meet particular expectations in order to receive God's grace. But grace, in its truest form, is not about fitting into a set of prescribed behaviors. It is about recognizing that God's love for us is not contingent upon our actions. God's grace transcends our shortcomings and embraces us in our brokenness. Jesus Christ exemplified this radical grace throughout His life and ministry. In the Gospels, we see Him extend grace to sinners, outcasts, and those deemed unworthy by society's standards. He dined with tax collectors and prostitutes, healed the sick and the blind, and forgave those who had wronged Him. One of the most poignant examples of grace is found in the story of the woman caught in adultery, as told in the Gospel of John. The religious leaders bring the woman before Jesus, ready to stone her as prescribed by the law of Moses. But Jesus, rather than condemning her, responds, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, The accusers drop their stones and leave, and Jesus, showing grace, tells the woman, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Jesus did not ask the woman to earn forgiveness, nor did he require her to prove her worthiness. He offered grace freely, unconditionally, regardless of her past actions. This story, and many others like it, demonstrates the core message of grace. We are loved not because of our goodness, but because of God's love for us. This concept of unearned grace stands in stark contrast to many of the world's systems of reward and punishment. In the world, we often experience love and acceptance based on our performance. People love us when we are good, when we are successful, when we meet their expectations. But God's love does not operate on these terms. His grace is not conditional. It is not dependent on our success or failure. It is not given to us only when we have proven ourselves worthy. God's love is steady and unchanging, and His grace is a reflection of that constant, unwavering love. The freedom that comes from understanding grace is life-changing. When we realize that we cannot earn God's grace, we are free to stop striving for approval and to rest in the truth that we are already accepted. We are free to stop measuring ourselves by worldly standards and to live in the knowledge that our worth is not dependent on what we accomplish or how we compare to others. This freedom allows us to love and accept others in the same way, without judgment, without conditions, without the need for them to earn our favor. Moreover, understanding grace transforms the way we view our own mistakes and failures. When we believe that grace is unearned, we no longer see our shortcomings as obstacles to God's love, but as opportunities for grace to work in our lives. We don't have to hide our failures or pretend to be perfect. Instead, we can approach God with honesty, knowing that His grace is sufficient to cover our imperfections. Grace does not ask us to be perfect. It asks us to be honest, humble, and willing to receive the gift that is freely offered. Ultimately, the truth that grace is a gift not earned is one of the most profound expressions of God's love for humanity. It speaks to the very heart of the gospel message that God's love for us is not based on our merit, but on His infinite goodness. It is a love that accepts us as we are, broken and imperfect, and offers us the chance to be made whole. Grace is the foundation of our faith, and it is the very thing that empowers us to live lives of compassion, humility, and love toward others. God's power is transformative. The nature of divine power, as understood in the Christian tradition, is radically different from the concept of power that dominates human experience. In our world, power is often associated with control, dominance, and the ability to bend others to our will. Power is used to assert authority, to manipulate situations, or to exert influence over others. It's often about imposing one's will on the world or maintaining a certain level of control over circumstances. Yet the power of God operates in an entirely different way. It is not a power that crushes or dominates. It is a power that heals, restores, and transforms. One of the most striking features of God's power is its capacity to transform lives. The Bible is filled with stories of people whose lives were radically altered when they encountered the power of God. These stories are not just about external miracles. They are also about inner transformations, about people being changed, not just healed. The power of God reaches into the deepest recesses of the human heart, turning it from stone to flesh, from bitterness to love, from despair to hope. The story of Saul's conversion is not unique. Throughout the scriptures, we see the power of God at work in the lives of individuals who were lost, broken, and without hope, but who were radically transformed through an encounter with the divine. The story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, is another example. Zacchaeus was wealthy, but he was despised by his community because of his occupation and his greed. When he encountered Jesus, however, something extraordinary happened. He did not just receive forgiveness for his sins, he experienced a complete transformation. Zacchaeus declared that he would give half of his possessions to the poor and repay 4 times the amount he had taken through fraud. This is a remarkable change in character, a complete reversal of his previous way of life. The power of God had entered his heart, and the result was a transformed life, a life that was now oriented toward generosity, restitution, and humility. These stories illustrate the transformative nature of God's power. The change that occurs when God's power is at work is not superficial or temporary. It is profound and lasting. It reaches beyond external circumstances and into the very core of a person is. In fact, this is what distinguishes the power of God from the power that the world often prizes. Worldly power is often about outward appearances, about changing the surface or influencing the environment in such a way that it aligns with one's desires. But divine power operates at a much deeper level. It changes the heart, the mind, and the soul. It is a power that makes people new from the inside out, a power that does not simply alter behavior but transforms character and nature. This transformative power of God is not limited to the stories we read in the Bible. It continues to work in the lives of believers today. Each of us, in our own way, can testify to the transformative power of God's presence in our lives. There are countless stories of individuals who have been radically changed by their encounter with God, people who were once trapped in addiction, in despair, in hatred, or in hopelessness, but who have been set free by the power of God. These are not just one-off miracles, but only experiences of transformation. People's lives are changed every day as they come into contact with the power of God through faith, prayer, and the work of the Holy Spirit. The power of God is not limited to transforming individual lives, however. It is also a power that has the capacity to transform entire communities and even nations. History is filled with examples of social movements and revolutions that were driven by a deep sense of the transformative power of God. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, and countless other social justice movements throughout history have been fueled by people who believed that God's power could bring about systemic change in society. When people come together under the influence of God's transformative power, they are able to challenge the status quo, to fight against injustice, and to work toward a world where love, peace, and equality reign. One of the key elements of this transformative power is its ability to bring healing. The Bible speaks of God's power to heal, not just physically, but also emotionally, spiritually, and relationally. In the Gospels, we read about Jesus healing the sick, the blind, the lame, and even raising the dead. But more than just physical healing, the stories show us that God's power can heal the brokenness in our hearts and minds. The woman who touched Jesus' garment and was healed of her hemorrhage, for example, was not just physically healed. Jesus told her daughter, "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Her encounter with Jesus was not just a moment of physical restoration, it was a moment of spiritual renewal as well. This healing power is not confined to the past, it is available to us today. Many people have experienced deep emotional or spiritual healing through their relationship with God. The power of God can heal old wounds, broken relationships, and years of pain. It can bring forgiveness, release from guilt, and peace in the midst of turmoil. It is a power that reaches into the darkest parts of our lives and brings light, comfort, and wholeness. But this power is not always immediate, and it is not always the way we expect it to be. Sometimes God's transformative power works gradually, over time as we grow in faith and understanding. Sometimes it involves pain and struggle as the old parts of us are purged away to make room for something new. But no matter the process, the result is the same. The power of God is at work in our lives, making us more and more into the people He created us to be. The transformative power of God is a power that cannot be replicated by human strength or wisdom. It is a power that is beyond our comprehension, beyond our control, and yet it is available to us through faith. It is the power that sustains us through trials, that gives us courage in the face of fear, that enables us to love the unlovable, and that moves us to seek justice, peace, and reconciliation in the world. This is the power that comes from God alone, and it is a power that is always at work, transforming us and the world around us in ways we may not always see or understand. Restoration over domination is a theme that runs through the Bible and serves as one of the central characteristics of God's interaction with the world. Human beings, in their pursuit of power, often seek to dominate, control, and impose their will on others. We can see this in the political systems, business practices, and even in personal relationships that are marked by manipulation, coercion, and the desire for authority. Power is often wielded to subdue, conquer, and to assert control. This is the way of the world, a world that believes strength is measured by dominance and success is gauged by the ability to exert influence over others. However, God's power does not work in this way. The Bible paints a radically different picture of power, a power that does not seek to dominate but to restore. From the very beginning, God's desire has been to restore creation to its intended harmony and order. The Genesis account reveals a God who creates a good world and desires for humanity to live in peace with one another and with all of creation. When sin enters the world, it disrupts that peace, introducing division, chaos, and brokenness into every facet of life. Yet God's response to this brokenness is not one of domination but of restoration. He does not seek to impose his power to crush humanity's disobedience. Instead, he seeks to restore what has been lost, to bring healing where there is pain, and to offer redemption where there is destruction. This theme of restoration is seen most clearly in the life and work of Jesus Christ. Jesus came not as a conqueror seeking to dominate the world, but as a servant seeking to restore it. The Gospels describe his ministry as one of healing the sick, restoring sight to the blind, forgiving sinners, and reconciling people to God. Jesus, who had every right to wield power as the Son of God, did not come to the world to assert his dominance over it. Instead, he came to serve. His power was not demonstrated in military might or political maneuvering, but in acts of love, compassion, and self-sacrifice. When his disciples wanted to argue about who would be the greatest among them, Jesus responded, "Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave." This reversal of the world's values, where greatness is found in service and power is found in humility, captures the essence of God's restorative power. In the death and resurrection of Jesus, this theme of restoration reaches its climax. Through his death, Jesus takes upon himself the weight of human sin and brokenness. He enters into the darkness of human suffering, not to defeat it through force, but to absorb it, heal it, and ultimately overcome it through his resurrection. The cross is the ultimate symbol of God's power, but it is not a power that crushes or dominates. It is a power that restores, redeems, and transforms. On the cross, God's love and justice meet in a profound act of restoration, offering forgiveness to all who will receive it. The resurrection is the victory of life over death, light over darkness, and restoration over destruction. In Christ, the power of God is not seen in domination, but in redemption and restoration. Throughout the scriptures, God is portrayed as a restorer of what has been broken. The Old Testament prophets frequently speak of God's promise to restore Israel to its former glory, not by military conquest or political domination, but through healing, renewal, and the bringing of justice. In the book of Isaiah, for example, God promises to bring comfort to his people, to bind up their wounds, and to rebuild the ruined cities. This promise of restoration is not just physical or material, it is also spiritual. God desires to restore humanity's relationship with him, which was broken by sin. Through his grace, God offers a path of reconciliation, one that leads to wholeness and peace. The Psalms also reflect this restorative nature of God's power. Over and over again, the psalmists call out to God for restoration in times of distress. Psalm 23, perhaps the most well-known of all the Psalms, speaks of God as the shepherd who restores the soul. He restores my soul, the psalmist writes, capturing the deep longing of the human heart for spiritual renewal. This restoration is not a mere return to the status quo. It is a deep, transformative healing that brings peace, guidance, and wholeness. The image of God as a shepherd, leading his people beside still waters and restoring their souls, is a powerful symbol of God's restorative care. This theme of restoration over domination also speaks to the way in which God interacts with us as individuals. So often in life, we are tempted to dominate our circumstances, to control our surroundings, or assert our will over others. We seek power over situations, and we view challenges as things to be conquered. But God calls us to something different. Rather than focusing on domination, God calls us to trust in his power to restore. When we face difficulty, loss, or hardship, we are not called to fight against God or to struggle on our own in an attempt to assert control. We are called to surrender, to trust that God will restore what has been broken. This doesn't mean that God will always remove the challenges we face. In fact, often it is through the struggles that we experience restoration. But in the midst of those challenges, God's power is at work in ways that we may not immediately see. Restoration often comes in unexpected ways, through the support of others, through personal growth, through moments of peace and clarity in the midst of turmoil. The power of God works quietly, sometimes behind the scenes, bringing healing and renewal in ways that transcend our human understanding. The church itself is also called to be an agent of restoration in the world. Just as God restores the brokenness in our lives, so too is the church called to restore the brokenness in the world. The church is not meant to be a place of domination, but a community that embodies the restorative power of God. It is meant to be a place where people find healing, forgiveness, and renewal. The church's mission is not to impose its will on the world, but to serve as a vessel for God's restorative power, bringing the message of reconciliation and redemption to all people. One of the most powerful ways the church participates in this restorative work is through acts of justice and mercy. In a world that is often marked by injustice, inequality, and suffering, the church is called to stand in the gap, to speak for the oppressed, and to work toward a world where peace and justice reign. This is a restorative mission, one that seeks to heal the brokenness in society and to restore the dignity of every person. Whether through feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, advocating for the marginalized, or standing against systems of injustice, the church embodies the power of restoration that God has made available to all people. Ultimately, the restorative power of God is not just something that is seen in isolated acts of kindness or in individual transformations. It is a cosmic, sweeping restoration that extends to all of creation. The New Testament speaks of a future time when God will restore all things, when heaven and earth will be renewed, and when God will wipe away every tear. The ultimate restoration that God promises is not just the healing of individuals, but the renewal of the entire created order. In this final restoration, there will be no more pain, no more sorrow, no more death, and no more sin. God's power will bring about a new heaven and a new earth, where His peace and justice will reign forever. In the restoration of all things, God's true power will be fully revealed, not in domination, but in the complete and final healing of the world. Personal stories of grace are meant to be shared. The beauty and power of God's grace are not meant to remain hidden or contained. Rather, they are meant to be shared with others. Each individual who has experienced God's grace holds within them a story that is both unique and universal. Unique because it reflects their personal journey and the specific ways in which God has worked in their life. And universal because God's grace is available to all regardless of their past, their present struggles, or their circumstances. Sharing these stories is not only a way of expressing gratitude for the grace received, but it also serves as a testimony to others of the transformative power of God's love. In the Bible, stories of grace are woven throughout the narratives, from the stories of Israel's deliverance to the personal testimonies of the apostles. The Apostle Paul, for example, frequently shared his own testimony of how God's grace radically transformed him. He was a persecutor of Christians, a man who sought to destroy the very movement that Jesus had started. Yet when Paul encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, his life was completely changed. His story of conversion became a powerful testimony to the grace of God, showing that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. Paul's story was not just a personal one, it was a story meant to be shared with others as a sign of hope and encouragement. The act of sharing personal stories of grace is deeply biblical. In the Gospel of John, Jesus heals a man born blind. When the Pharisees question the man about his healing, he responds, "One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." This simple statement encapsulates the power of personal testimony. The man does not get into theological debates or attempt to explain the mystery of his healing. Instead, he shares his experience. He was blind, but now he can see. His story is a witness to the grace of God, and in sharing it, he not only gives glory to God, but also invites others to understand the transformative power of grace in his life. In many ways, personal stories of grace are one of the most compelling ways to bear witness to God's work in the world. When we share our stories, we invite others into the narrative of grace that we ourselves have experienced. These stories have the power to break down walls of skepticism, fear, and misunderstanding because they reflect the reality of God's presence and action in the world. They are not abstract theological concepts or distant historical events. They are lived experiences, proof that God is still active today, transforming lives and extending His love to all. The sharing of personal stories is not about boasting or elevating oneself. It is about acknowledging that we have been recipients of grace and that our lives are a testimony to God's faithfulness. It is a humbling act, for in sharing our story, we acknowledge that we did nothing to deserve the grace we have received. Just as the blind man did not heal himself, neither did we earn the grace that God has given to us. It is an unmerited gift, and the act of sharing it with others is an acknowledgement that we are instruments through which God's grace flows into the world. There is something deeply powerful about hearing the stories of others, especially when those stories reflect God's grace in their lives. These stories remind us that we are not alone in our struggles, our doubts, or our journeys of faith. They show us that grace is not a one-time event, but a continual presence that shapes and reshapes us throughout our lives. In hearing the stories of others, we are reminded that God's grace is not limited to certain people or certain situations, but is available to all who call on His name. Each story is a reflection of the unique way in which God meets us in our specific circumstances, bringing hope, healing, and transformation. The sharing of stories is also a means of encouragement. When we hear about how God has worked in the lives of others, it strengthens our own faith and encourages us to trust in His grace. The stories of grace we share do not just recount past events, they serve as ongoing reminders that God is at work in the present, and that He is faithful to continue His work of restoration and transformation. Just as the people of Israel were encouraged by the stories of how God delivered them from slavery in Egypt, so too are we encouraged by hearing stories of how God continues to deliver and restore His people today. Sometimes we might hesitate to share our stories, thinking that they are too insignificant or too ordinary to make a difference. However, the truth is that no story of grace is too small to be meaningful. Each story reflects the love and power of God at work in the world, and each has the potential to touch someone else's life. Even the smallest moments of grace, such as a prayer answered, a change in attitude, or a quiet moment of peace in the midst of chaos, can have a profound impact when shared with others. God's grace is present in every moment of life. And it is through the sharing of these moments that we can help others see the beauty and power of God's work in the world. Additionally, personal stories of grace create a ripple effect. When one person shares their story of grace, it can inspire others to share theirs, creating a chain of testimony that spreads far beyond the initial telling. Stories of grace are contagious in the best possible way. They invite others to open their hearts, to reflect on their own experiences, and to respond to God's grace in their own lives. This chain reaction of shared grace is part of the larger narrative of God's work in the world, a story that continues to unfold through each person who encounters His love. In a sense, personal stories of grace are also acts of worship. They are offerings of gratitude and praise for what God has done in our lives. To share our story is to acknowledge that we are the recipients of His mercy and to recognize that every good thing we have is a gift from Him. Just as the psalmists often recount the mighty acts of God as a form of worship, so too do we engage in worship when we share the story of God's grace in our lives. In doing so, we honor God and bear witness to the ongoing work of His kingdom on earth. When we share our personal stories of grace, we are participating in a larger movement of God's redemptive work in the world. These stories do not belong to us alone. They are part of the story of God's grace and redemption that spans generations, cultures, and time. As we share our stories, we become part of that grand narrative, helping to tell the world that God's grace is real, transformative, and available to all who seek it. In the act of sharing, we not only celebrate God's grace, but also invite others into the transformative journey that we have experienced, offering them hope, healing, and the possibility of their own encounter with grace.